Hello, welcome to part one of our notes, Causes of the Civil War, Social Causes. We're going to do this in two parts. I'm going to do part one today, and then you guys are going to watch part two tomorrow. So, before we left on break, we were talking about the economic causes of the war and the political causes. Today we're going to talk about social causes, which really means kind of like anything that's kind of like either in the media or people, things that influence personal opinion, things like that. And of course, that date that we keep talking about is the official start of the war, April 12th of 1861. So kind of keep that in the back of your mind as we go through some of these things today and how close we are in getting to that actual event that triggers the start of the war, actually the official start of the war. All right, so the first thing we're going to talk about today is a book. It's a book called Uncle Tom's Cabin. It was published by an author named Harriet Beecher Stowe in 1852. And the important thing about this book is that it tells the story of slave life in the South. We're going to watch a little video here in a second that kind of talks about it. But this is going to be a really important influence on people, particularly in the North that maybe don't have slavery around them on a regular basis. This is a story about a slave and what it's like in the South. And so they're going to form a lot of their opinions about slavery based off of this book. So let's go ahead and watch this short clip about Harriet Beecher Stowe and Uncle Tom's Cabin.
He wants to be noticed.
Don't they all?
In the spring of 1833, Harriet and two friends crossed over the river into neighboring Kentucky. She had never before visited a slave state.
We have this fine specimen here. What do you get? 25? 50? We got 50 going once. 50 going twice. 50 sold to the gentleman here. How you gentlemen doing this nice North Kentucky day? Gotta keep this thing going.
What Stowe sees there is a human thing. She sees these people. I mean, they are human beings. She's confronted with it in such an intimate way. And I think that never leaves her.
Harriet Beecher Stowe, who's probably one of the best known abolitionists because she wrote Uncle Tom's Cabin, was a young mother who lost her son, and her son Charlie died of cholera, and she kind of connected that loss, her loss of her child, with a slave mother's loss of their children. And she wrote the book that really changed the hearts and minds of many Americans because she put slavery in really human terms. She really humanized the experience of slavery for many Americans and really won over people in writing that book.
Harriet Beecher Stowe wrote Uncle Tom's Cabin shortly after one of her children had passed away. But she had been it had been bubbling in her for quite a while. And after her son passed away, she poured all of that emotion and life and energy into the book. I think she said that she didn't even feel as though she was writing it. She felt like somebody else was sort of giving her this message to put onto the page. Hopefully people who watch the show will take away from it the sense that she was a real person, and that I think it's easy for the humanity of historical figures to sort of get lost over the course of time, but that she was just an ordinary woman who was able to create a piece of art that then genuinely had an effect on the world.
So Uncle Tom's Cabin becomes one of the most influential books ever published in United States history. Now think about this statistic. In the first year that it was published, it sold 300,000 copies. We're talking about in the mid-1850s here. So there weren't like huge bookstores and Amazon and all those kinds of things. That is a just humongous number of books to be sold at that time period. It is the second most popular book in the 19th century, so that means in the entire 1800s. The only book which sold more copies than Uncle Tom's Cabin was the Bible. Okay. So the reason why this novel is important is because it has a major impact on how people view slavery, primarily in the northern states. So if you lived in, say, Massachusetts, you probably didn't have a lot of personal experience with slavery because people just didn't travel that much at that time period. So when you read this book as somebody in, for example, Massachusetts, you start to get an opinion about what slavery is like, and it becomes kind of like real for you. All right. Now, to give you one last kind of anecdote about how important this book is, it's rumored that at one point, Harriet Beecher Stowe goes to talk to President Lincoln once the Civil War has started. And Lincoln starts their conversation by saying, "Oh, so you're the little lady that started this war." So Uncle Tom's Cabin, just a lot of social significance in kind of how people perceive slavery, especially in the North. All right, so our next person is John Brown. Here's an actual picture of John Brown. He is a revolutionary abolitionist. All right. Now, John Brown believed that God wanted to use him as an instrument to try and end slavery in any way possible. So he felt like God was working through him. And the important thing to realize about John Brown is John Brown goes to extremes to try and support that belief. Okay. So John Brown is viewed as either a good person from the abolitionist side, or a terrorist or a murderer from people that are pro-slavery. So he's very much an extremist, and kind of how you view slavery kind of depends on how you see John Brown. So let's watch a little clip about John Brown.
For years, John Brown had been trying to divine God's purpose, to make sense of his afflictions. He had once been a successful merchant and tanner, a good provider to his family. But then, suddenly, his life collapsed. A series of business disasters plunged him deep into debt.
Most abolitionists for decades were pacifists and believed in persuading people about the moral wrong of slavery. John Brown didn't really believe that would work, and he put his life on the line. Many people would call him a terrorist. He attacked the Federal Armory at Harper's Ferry, but in doing so, he actually became kind of a martyr for the cause and rallied a lot of northern support, and in many ways provoked what became a terrible conflict in the United States and the Civil War.
The question he was asking in his being, which was, to what extent is violence acceptable or necessary for political change, is a question we have certainly asked throughout American history. The accounts of Brown all say how beguiling he was. He's described often like iron or like granite. He had this steadfast quality, and I think when you read even the writings he left behind, his letters and some of his unfinished autobiography, there was a sincerity and a simplicity to him, an earnestness to him.
So John Brown was originally from the East Coast, and then in 1855 he moved to Kansas to try and help sway the vote that we talked about in our notes before break, talking about how Kansas was going to get to vote if they wanted to be a free state or a slave state. So he's one of the abolitionists that picks up his life, moves his family halfway across the continent, goes to Kansas, and there's several events that happen around the 1855 time period where he and his sons reportedly at one point go and find several men, 5 men, that were supposedly professional slave catchers. And they went to their homes and in the middle of the night basically pulled them out of their homes and killed them. Okay. He was also involved in several other violent things that happened in Kansas during the Bleeding Kansas period. So that's kind of the first part of the John Brown story, is how he's involved in Bleeding Kansas in the mid-1850s. Then in 1859, he goes to the East Coast and he leads an attack on an arsenal, a federal arsenal, at Harper's Ferry, Virginia. His plan is to get a bunch of people together, go to the federal arsenal, which has gunpowder, guns, cannons. It's where the military stores different types of like military objects and things like that. And he's able to successfully overtake the arsenal for a short period of time. And then once reinforcements come in, he's captured and his men are captured. But his idea is he's going to try and capture all these guns and then lead slave rebellions throughout the South. And that was how he was going to lead this abolitionist cause in the South and try and free a bunch of slaves by giving them arms and giving them guns and things like that. So he's actually arrested after this failed attempt to get the federal arsenal in Virginia. Like I said here, he's eventually wanting to capture the guns and then lead a slave revolt. The raid fails. Brown is captured. He's found guilty of treason. He's actually the first person ever to be found guilty of treason, and he's sentenced to hang. So at this point, John Brown is viewed as either a martyr by the abolitionists or a terrorist by people that were pro-slavery. So a martyr is somebody that dies for a cause. So the people in the North saw this as being like a noble effort to try and end slavery. People in the South view it as basically a person that's treasonous to the American government because he tried to get a federal arsenal. He is executed on December 2nd of 1859. So again, kind of think about that date. We're only about 2 years or so away from the actual start of the Civil War. And his death really creates a lot of talk around the country about the issue of slavery. So he's very much a national figure, first in Kansas and then on the East Coast at Harper's Ferry. I wanted to show you this. This is a really famous mural that is on the wall in the Capitol, the Kansas Capitol. It's called Tragic Prelude, and it's by an author or by an artist named John Stuart Curry. It was painted in the late 1930s, and it's huge. It takes up like an entire wall in the Capitol, in the hallway. And at the middle of this, this is actually John Brown. So this entire mural is supposed to depict the violence of Bleeding Kansas and the uncertainty. You can see John Brown here in the middle. He has a gun in one hand, and then he has a Bible in the other. And you can see figures from both the Confederate side and the Union side. You have dead soldiers from both sides here. You can see in the background, it's kind of depicting the violence of what's happening in Kansas at the time. And they do that by showing some of the natural forces of nature. You've got wildfires. You have tornadoes here. We're going to talk a little bit later about things like Order Number 11, where people were like forced out of their farms and their homes. And so you see people here that are kind of being forced away from their homes and being pushed with all their belongings and stuff away. So this is kind of a famous image of John Brown. You can kind of see his big beard kind of flowing there. He was known for his really heavy, thick white beard. And this actually appears in like popular culture quite a bit. This is actually the cover of the first album by a band named Kansas. So if you know anything about like classic rock, Carry On My Wayward Son is probably their most famous song. This was what they chose to use as their album cover in 1974 when they had their first LP that came out. And then even recently, this is from a couple years ago, this was at a Kansas game. We'll talk a little bit later more about kind of the conflict between Kansas and Missouri as the Civil War starts to kind of begin. But this was at a KU basketball game in Lawrence, Kansas. And the student body made this big mural to kind of replicate that mural that's in the Capitol building. And you can see here they still have the gun in one hand, and then they have an NCAA national championship trophy in the other. And even today, you'll see shirts sometimes that you can buy in like Lawrence, Kansas t-shirt stores and stuff like that that reference John Brown. So even today, John Brown is a figure that is brought up in popular culture. All right, so that's the end of part 1. I want to keep this kind of short and brief. So that's part 1 of the social causes. When we pick up again tomorrow, I'll talk about the second half of notes and talk about part 2 of the social causes of the Civil War. Thanks, guys.